Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us today. Just a bit of context to the discussion we're about to have. So in the run-up to COP26, IES have been working with members, professional bodies and other environmental scientists from across the sector to shape the discussion and launch activities over 6 key themes. So the themes so far have been sustainability, transformation, adaptation, green society, economy, and now we're at solutions, the final theme. And so we're going to be asking how we can most effectively fight climate change. So within solutions, we have 4 themes in line with the COP26 presidency. So we've got nature, clean transport, adaptation and resilience, finance, and of course, energy transitions, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So the energy sector obviously generates incredible amounts of emissions, but there are also incredible solutions that have already been developed and are already available, and many more that are on the way. So that's what we'll be discussing today. My name is Brigette Reid. I'm the Director of Green Arch Consulting and co-founder of Frontiera. My background is in renewable energy. So I used to work for the Green Investment Group, which is one of the largest investors in renewables across the world. And now I'm focused on doing sort of environmental and social due diligence of renewable assets. So I'm very lucky to be joined today with some other great speakers. So James, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm James Barwick. I work for Wyke Farms Limited in Somerset, and I am their renewable energy technical manager. Been working at Wyke now for nearly just over now 6 years, and I came out of university after studying a degree in environmental science, and then went into the anaerobic digestion part of our business, and then I've progressed on then to looking at renewables as a whole within our business, and then also all the environmental side that then feeds into. So it's a really important part of what we do, something that I'm very passionate about after doing it at university, and I think it's a growing industry. It's that there's parts that we need to be pioneering, we need to be trying, and we need to be helping to inform business, governments, and therefore of what we can be doing to improve energy and the environment for future generations.
Great, thanks James. And Christabel, could you give us a brief introduction of yourself as well?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Christabel Watts. I'm a project manager and energy advisor at the Environment Centre, and we're a Southampton-based charity. We cover the themes of sort of emission reduction, sustainability, energy efficiency, and keeping people warm and well in their homes, and also improving air quality. And so I work sort of across those projects, but particular relevance today is the work that we do around energy efficiency in the built environment, predominantly the domestic sector, and the energy advice that we give to people, everyone from what we would call an able to pay market to the sort of fuel poor and the affordable warmth agenda as well.
Great, we've got a great team that can, I think within this conversation we can solve the energy crisis today. That's the plan. And where are you both based?
I'm in Southampton, so I live in Southampton and our charity is based in Southampton, but we work across Hampshire, Southampton and Portsmouth.
Great. What about you, James?
Yeah, I'm based in Somerset, so right kind of on the Somerset, Dorset, Wiltshire border, and yeah, that's where our main company facilities are.
Great. So just to spice things up, I'm actually in Mexico at the moment. So I'm based in Mexico, and I'm currently in a small town that this is probably perfect for this call. The electricity here isn't always reliable. So bear with me if we run into any problems. But let's jump into it. So we've got 5 questions that we want to run through today. And yeah, so just keen to get all your ideas about how we can solve the energy transition in light of the climate crisis that we're currently battling at the moment. So let's begin with James. What would the overall picture of energy composition look like in a transformed society? And Christabel, jump in whenever you feel like you have something to add to James.
I think from where we move forward now in like an energy composition wise, I think we're going to be touching on, and I'm sure more in this conversation, on both large scale and small scale renewables. There's a home for both, and we're not looking at a one solution fits all scenario. I think energy composition is probably going to increase the amount of self-generation out there. I think more and more businesses and more even in the domestic sector are going to be looking at self-generation, and we're seeing that more and more to the forefront of our minds now as energy prices are increasing. People, businesses are having to look at what they need to be doing to reduce cost and also benefit the environment. The environment itself is gone right to the top of the agenda, and in any operations now, it's right at the forefront of people's minds of what they're doing and how things are progressing.
Christabel, what about you? What do you think?
So from my perspective, I think where I come across sort of energy composition most commonly is how we heat our homes. So the 2/3 to 3/4 of the energy use in a home is the heating and the hot water. And so when I think about energy composition, I'm probably thinking on that more micro scale than the national scale, but it definitely ties in. So I think we're looking at kind of three main areas for heating homes. And I certainly don't think that we've cracked the solution yet, but one is the electrification of heating. So whether that's storage heaters or air source heat pumps, and that could be the electric coming from a renewable source, whether that's solar panels on the house or whether it's coming through renewable through the grid. It then sort of district heating or combined heat and power, where they distribute heat or hot water on a local level, and then also an alternative form of gas. So a lot of people at the moment, especially in our area, are talking about hydrogen ready boilers, which is certainly, I don't think, going to be something that can be done on a national scale. I think a lot of these, there's going to be different compositions depending on the area in the country, but that obviously is an alternative. And then there is biomass and wood burners, which are talked about carbon heating, but I think just in terms of supply and also the air pollution aspect, they're probably not going to be the main solutions on a local level, especially in an urban environment. So that's where I think about energy composition, but it's really interesting to hear what we might be, if we do still have a grid working in the same way, where that electricity and gas might come from.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that, it's interesting hearing both of your point of views, Christabel at micro level, and then James on the kind of national level. And for me, I sort of think about it more in terms of the international level. So going back to James's point where you said before, I think it will totally depend on the situation. And I think that is exactly what I think per country as well. So I think the kind of energy composition per country will be dramatically different, and it will reflect the kind of situation or the geographical location or the resources they have at where that country is located. So the UK is obviously quite a small country, so but with lots of wind resource. So your offshore wind industry is obviously huge, and that is super interesting, because I think that enables you to do all those really interesting things at the micro level as well. But yeah, I see the energy composition in different countries to be probably quite different. So I think we'll probably get further and further away from that fossil fuels. Hopefully I've got some dreams that we might be able to get rid of it. But I think I agree that I think it'll take quite a long time, but I think that if we look at countries like Australia, for example, which is where I'm from, with such a diverse, sort of like a geographically diverse population in terms of there's such a long distance before the between each of the cities or maybe each of the towns, the energy composition profile is going to be a lot different. We can, with countries that are kind of much more stretched out, it makes more sense to have microgrids everywhere where they're self-generating, having lots of rooftop solar, and working on that kind of micro scale within the country. But then, yeah, when you've got countries like the UK or others in Europe, where, say, if we look at the Nordic countries that already have a lot of hydro, it makes sense to sort of keep pushing it that way. Super interesting there. I think we've got a pretty good mix going on here in terms of our sort of scales.
Yeah,
James,
I think as well, sorry, just to say that, like, at the end of the day, I think I'd love to be at the point, like you said, where we can say we're completely running our energy composition on renewables. That's where we want to be. And I think anyone that's kind of involved in the environment and energy sector, that's our main goal. But we've got to be pushing for some more large scale renewable energy generation. I know nuclear is obviously a big thing out there at the moment, and there's pros and cons to all these energy sources, but we've got to be making some big developments in large scale renewable energy generation.
Yeah, particularly sorry, go on, Christabel.
I was just going to say, I wanted to pick up on, you said energy composition transition, and I think a transition is a really key part of that, because there's going to be short-term solutions and longer-term solutions, and what we've been discussing about a more tailored, individual, geographic, specific approach, I think that's probably the way that we want to go, that we want to be doing something, that's as local as possible, harnessing the renewables that are locally, but also that works for that area, that temperature, those types of buildings, and so that we're not putting all our eggs in one basket. We're not going down routes that perhaps we've done in the past, and then it's come back as an issue. And I think James touched on that the grid in terms of the power distribution is starting to creak, it seems. And I know that we've had in the past, we moved from town gas to natural gas, and away from coal and all of those. And so we have seen those massive changes, but I think if we're doing it on a local scale, if we're changing over to hydrogen, it's going to work much better, in areas where we can produce hydrogen as low carbon as possible, but also you're just doing, one area or one town or something, because changing a whole gas network over to a completely different fuel will be quite a task.
And where do you see hydrogen do you see that becoming quite a big part of the energy composition makeup in the future?
I'll go. I think there's all the different colours of hydrogen that are available, the greens, the blues, the pinks, I think that if we're going to go down a hydrogen route, I think it should be in an area where it can be produced as low carbon as possible. I think we might touch on this later, but I would say that we want to avoid carbon capture and storage if we can, and use that sort of as a last resort for those areas where we can't phase out those renewables, those fossil fuels. And so hydrogen, they're certainly trialling it in the UK, and they're adding it into the mix. But I don't know whether actually it's going to be as large a scale. But there's no perfect solution within low carbon heating, as I alluded to earlier, because the electrification and air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps that we're hearing so much about, which I think will probably be the majority of heating solutions, it requires such an upgrade of house fabric, and certainly for we've got some of the oldest and least efficient buildings in this country, and that's quite a difficult task to upgrade them, and all of the bits and pieces that come along with that. So I think hydrogen will end up being part of the mix, certainly in the short term, but it's also not a quick task to introduce hydrogen. But yeah, if gas is going, if that's the direction, then we're going to have something replacing it, and I think in some areas that might be it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think we've got, what was it, 2% of hydrogen that's currently produced is green hydrogen. So we've got a long way to go. But what do you think, James, on the hydrogen front? Everyone's talking about it.
Yeah, as you say, there's many different colours, but it's one of those where I don't feel, kind of like what you were saying a minute ago, I don't feel it's been pushed enough. I think if it was going to be the next best thing, I think it would have probably been pushed by now. And I don't think enough people know about hydrogen. Like we say, there's different types. And I think if a lot of people out there saw hydrogen as an alternative fuel, then I think people might jump at it without knowing the origins of it fully. So it's one of those to be slightly aware of, I think, and we need to know a little bit more about it, and on what scale as well can it be used, if there are the options for it in society. But it's an area that I've not looked at in much detail, and it's not something that's been brought to the forefront of my mind, probably because there are other options out there that people are more interested in.
Yeah, interesting, because I've heard some people like sort of describing it as the silver bullet to climate change, or the energy transition at least. But it was quite interesting listening to the head of Enel, the large energy company, who he basically said hydrogen's great, but at the end of the day, it's when you convert it from renewable energy to hydrogen, you lose energy along the way. So it's always going to be more efficient to just use the renewable energy directly. So I think I agree that I don't think there's a lot of understanding around it. I think it'll be interesting to see where that kind of industry goes, because I think there's a lot of hope in it, and particularly in countries like Australia. I know the UK are focusing on putting a lot of investment into it to develop a bit further, but we'll see how it goes. And maybe that brings us nicely onto the next question in terms of a technology that people are pumping a lot of resources into, and whether or not it is effective or not is the question. So how should carbon capture, utilisation and storage, CCUS, fit into our approach to the energy transition? Christabel, you touched on it briefly before. Do you want to kick us off with your thoughts on that?
Yes, I would say this is not a particular area of expertise for me. I'm like you, Brigette, that I sort of hope that we can phase out fossil fuels as much as possible, and really reduce our need for this. But as I've mentioned in previous conversations, that because we are going to be looking at fossil fuels in the mix in terms of some of the production, and because we're not entirely sure what low carbon heating is going to look like, that there will be an element of this. And I suppose it depends on sort of political will, and how fast we can move in a direction, and those short and long term goals, whether actually this ends up making up more of the industry.
Yeah, what about you, James?
Yeah, I'm in agreement really in the fact that it's one of those where none of us want to see fossil fuels in the energy mix, and it is an item obviously linked to fossil fuels, and how the carbon from them can be utilised, and it's one of those where there is this carbon capture, utilisation and storage technology out there. It's probably classed as what I suppose a very expensive technology, but it's obviously doing a purpose. And yes, it's one of those where I'm a bit unsure of how it's going to sit in society. It's obviously something that is being pushed, but I'd rather see fossil fuels gone and a renewable alternative there than going down this route. But like Christabel just said, where are we in short term and where are we in long term, and how's it going to fit in?
Yeah, yeah, thinking about that transition piece, it's quite interesting, isn't it, in terms of the long term. I found it really interesting recently, I think it was last week, one Andrew Forrester, who's like a mining magnate in Australia, he came out and made a statement that 80% of CCS, he was referring to CCS, 80% of the projects have failed to date, and most of the ones that haven't failed have not reached anywhere close to what their capacity, what they anticipated they'd be able to do. And so now it's quite interesting because I think we're in a point where, I mean, people have been trying to develop the technology for decades now. Like, it's been around for a while, but as you said, James, it's really expensive and it doesn't seem reliable. It doesn't seem like the technology's there yet, but we still see a lot of companies, governments putting a lot of funding into it, when, as you guys have pointed out, maybe that funding would be better sent prioritising into renewables or different options that have already been proven. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see in terms of how we can use it. Yeah, I think, James, as you've said previously, that maybe for those really hard to abate sectors where we really can't get rid of the emissions, we could use it there. But I don't think that the technology is there yet to be putting all our hopes and dreams in that basket. And I think we're sort of running out of time in terms of our ability to be able to have a change, to be able to prevent climate change from happening, or to happening to an extent that is catastrophic. But yeah, it's an interesting one. What about, can transformative change be driven better by innovation and technological development, or through intervention and regulation? James, what are your thoughts on that? Innovation and technology, or intervention and regulation?
This is the sitting on the fence answer of we need a bit of both.
We won't have any of those. We've got to go extreme one way or extreme. We've got to go extreme.
It's
no, happy with sitting on the fence.
We've got to have, to start off with, we've got to have a bit of top-down approach through regulation. We've got to have the governmental power of implementing, whether it's targets, regulation, or that for a greener energy future, and we've got to kind of start with that. Obviously, there's a lot of whether it's world leaders, countries, businesses, all talking about net zero targets, things like that. That's brilliant. That's where we want to be going. We need to be having these big, bold statements, but we've got to be investing in those technological developments. We've got to be investing in innovation, and we've got to be implementing it. We can't go halfway down the road and not get all the way to the end. We've got to be following it through. And I think it involves multiple parties to get to that end goal. But also, when we say about the kind of the intervention and that side of things, I think that we're all working on a shared infrastructure. Everyone is linked, and whether it's businesses, people, and I think that it needs everyone to kind of come together on some kind of level to allow implementation to happen.
Sorry, just cut out there for me for a second. But yeah, so your point there was that it enables, we need everybody to get together to enable it to happen. So not just the technology providers, but the governments as well. Christabel, what do you think about that?
So I would say in the area that I work in, we're kind of split down the middle. So around some of the things I've touched on already around low carbon heating and electricity generation that people are going to need in their homes and their businesses. We've seen, you know, technology in the electricity market has really improved that, and we need more of that, and we certainly need some innovation in the heating side of things, because that's not, you know, a guarantee at the moment. But then on the other side, to fly the flag for energy conservation and energy efficiency, those are pretty tried and tested. You know, we all know the energy advice of how to save in our homes, and people talk about boiling less in your kettle and putting an extra jumper on instead of turning up the heating. And then you know, a lot of the technology around installation is, you know, pretty tried and tested. You can't really go wrong with loft insulation, and certainly the wall insulation, if installed correctly and meeting all the sort of quality assurances, you know, is there and has been used for many years now. And so in that sense, that I think is where more intervention and regulation is required, whether that's for new home standards, whether it's for rental standards, where we're seeing, you know, some changes being made in terms of regulation, but also to encourage people to make those changes, because we're talking about people's homes. So you can't just can't just force people to make changes to their homes. You're going to need a carrot and a stick approach. So, you know, communicating people what the benefits are, and there's lots and lots of benefits to energy efficiency, even if we don't include climate change. You know, if we include, you know, saving money in your bills, you know, keeping warm and comfortable, saving money for the NHS in terms of health outcomes, improving air quality. But then we're also going to need, you know, a good enough supply chain. We saw with the Green Homes grant where it was suddenly brought in and there weren't enough installers. The way the funding worked and the administration didn't quite go to plan, and sort of people were really keen on getting those grants and making those improvements and spending their own money in addition to it, and then it sort of fell through. And then in terms of the stick approach, you know, we've heard lots of things about whether you need to meet a certain rating to rent, to sell your home, not just rent it, or whether, you know, you get a stamp duty rebate or council tax rebate if you refurbished your home. So I think those sort of more tried and tested approaches that we know and are available already, we're going to need some intervention and regulation around encouraging or pushing people to do it, and also making sure that the industry is there, that there is the quality and the trusted contractors to do the work. And that has its benefits because it's a huge green jobs opportunity, but I think that is going to need more of the regulation side of things.
So you're on the fence as well, or more towards regulation?
I suppose it depends on which you ask me about. I think I think energy efficiency is definitely the intervention and regulation, and the low carbon heating. I think we haven't yet, just, you know, what we have now is not necessarily how we're going to be heating our homes in 10-15 years.
Yeah, so a combination from both of you. From my perspective, I think I'm more on the policy side. I think looking at the UK, who's managed to get a really high level of integration of renewables into the system, I think a lot of that's been driven by policy. And then I look at Australia, who doesn't have as strong a policy at all. And they're still getting there. We've still got pretty, you know, it's still happening, but not at the rate that it could be happening. And I think a lot of that is due to policy and regulation that they. So it's just saying, from the Australian perspective, we've got support at the state level for these interventions, but at the federal level, we don't have that. So we haven't been able to go as far as we could or as quickly as we could. And then we look at a place like Mexico, where the federal government really supports the state petroleum, it's called Pemex. It's a state petrol and gas and fossil fuel company, essentially. And now the regulations have been flipped on their head, so that, going back to that priority, they're prioritised over renewables and everything else, essentially. So in terms of what's hitting the grid first, it's always going to be fossil fuels. And so that's where regulation and policy has directly flipped it on its head and said, actually, we're going to go away from renewables. And so for me, I think the technology and innovation side is definitely happening, and the cost is coming down, which means that people are doing it regardless of policy. They're doing it regardless of intervention. But whilst it's still coming down, and it's making more financial sense to put your money into renewables as opposed to putting it into a new fossil fuel refinery, for example, without the policy and regulations, we're not going to be able to do that fast enough, if at all. But I think that's quite interesting that we've gone from, I think that's kind of at the macro level, but I think it's really interesting to think from your perspective, Christabel, at the micro level, because yeah, they're kind of they're very different arenas that we're talking about there.
Yeah, and you're exactly right in the sense that actually they're linked in terms of policy drives innovation. If gas is phased out and we're no longer able to use gas from a policy level, then people are going to have to innovate and come up with the alternatives.
Yeah, what's the classic? Scarcity creates innovation. So, some great quote about that. Yeah, sort of be interesting. And yeah, it's quite interesting looking at the UK and the EU who have really strong policy and really strong regulations in that space. But then obviously, as you've pointed out, there's still a lot of room for that to be strengthened, or a lot of room for that to be refined, so that that you can have more effective solutions at all levels. Yeah, so I think in summary, we're on the fence. I think it's both. I think you need both for different sectors, for different challenges. Yeah.
It'd be interesting to hear if any of the other areas, any of the other solutions were entirely one or the other, or whether everything has that mixture of interventions.
Yeah, because I think, one of them, not that we're going to go down this path, but nature, for example, that requires, if we think about how to save nature, I think you're absolutely right. You probably need both as well. So who knows? Okay. Next one. How can we ensure renewable energy is a genuine option for all countries and communities during the climate transition? And Christabel, I think it'd be really interesting to get your take on this as well, because you do work on that micro scale. So if you think about applying the sort of solutions that you have at the moment, how could you put them? Are they applicable to all countries, or, what are your thoughts on that? How can we ensure renewable energy is a genuine option for all countries and communities?
Yes, looking at that kind of microgeneration or home heating options, I think that they're definitely not going to be the same across countries. But in order to make them, available to everyone, they need to be affordable and accessible, and they need to fit into whatever the local system is already. So, is there grid capacity for that, or is it something that's, entirely off grid? So, when we're talking about in the UK, where there are millions of people living in fuel poverty, we don't want people in fuel poverty to sort of bear the cost of some of those measures. And so, you know, when people are looking at ways of increasing energy efficiency or putting in low carbon heating options, certainly at the moment, a lot of the grant funding and the support available for people is for people on a low income, you know, or vulnerable groups, and so a lot of the technological innovations are sort of passed on through people's energy bills. So certainly, you know, some of the financial support, the grants that are available, and some of the changes are put back through the energy bills, which there are certain groups that are least able to afford them. And we're currently seeing unprecedented gas prices, which obviously affect the poorest first, and often they are not the groups that are using the most energy, that are putting their heating on the most, or have the highest carbon emissions. So I think that if we're talking about making them available to everyone, I think they need to be sort of local specific and working for the buildings and the area and the temperatures and climate of that area, and they need to be affordable and accessible. We quite often see social housing putting in, you know, social housing is going, you know, often above and beyond the standards, and actually is kind of an area of the sector you could see as leading the way. But they put in new renewable types of technology, but the people who then move into the property don't know how to work them. They don't know how the heating controls work. So, you know, even down to that level, if we're, you know, using different forms of heating than people are used to, and it's not a quick flick on and off or turn up the thermostat, then everyone needs to know how to use them to keep warm, and to not, you know, increase their costs or their emissions.
So there's an educational piece around community intervention as well.
Yes, definitely.
How does that currently work in kind of the field that you're working in? Do you go in and, you know, does it come with a manual when you move into a house, or is there, you know, how do you tackle that educational piece currently?
I would say that generally there are not manuals when you move into a house, because manuals are one of those things that a human has put into a drawer, and what then happens to it, you never know. So we've definitely done work in the past where a housing association has asked us to come in and have home visits and talk to their community about how to use them in the initial stages, and then actually getting us back again if there's a turnover of tenants, and providing a guide. I mean, things being online these days obviously makes it much more useful, because you don't have to have the paper copy, but certainly a lot of the people that we've worked with, and those people have been affected a lot by COVID, you know, the only access they have to their internet is data on their phone, and it's quite hard to read a manual or to find that if you've got limited data and you're just looking at it on a tiny screen. So yeah, there will be manuals. They're often, you know, there'll be the installer guide, which is often, you know, way above people's heads, and then there'll be the user manual. And in general, I would say that most people aren't able to interpret those. So part of the work that we do is about teaching people how to use their heating controls, and just explaining the differences. You know, air source heat pumps are, you know, a lower heating output than people might be used to with gas heating, and so it's just a different way of managing it, a different way of keeping your home warm, and you know, different expectations, I suppose. But you know, we are a charity. There are lots of other charities in the UK who do similar work, but it's very piecemeal, and the sort of support offered is, you know, depending, you know, I don't like to use the word postcode lottery, but it does really depend on, you know, how engaged your local authority are, what the funding is available, and there's different pots for different elements of it. So you hope that the local organisation covers all the elements, but they might not be able to, and they have to send you off to someone else to cover a different element of it. So I think there's definitely work that could be done about standardising that, and making it not, you know, I've kind of mentioned already that actually I think there is an element of local you know, benefits to having someone in your area, or who knows the kind of buildings and the areas, who can give you that information rather than necessarily a national number. But either way, I think that education, communication side of it also needs to be available to everyone. So it's not just the people that can get through on the phone line who can get that help.
Yeah, so that almost comes back to that kind of policy and regulation thing, that you need to have the government support there to be able to offer those services. And going back to a question, something you raised before about the supply chains. So thinking about the work that you do at the moment, and thinking about how we can take those solutions and apply them to different countries or different communities, how much does the supply chain impact what your ability to roll out some of these solutions?
Absolutely, hugely. It is a real problem, and we're kind of at a breaking point now where you know, in order to scale up, to go further, something drastic needs to change. So I think at the moment we don't have kind of standardized training around, you know, energy efficiency measures. So you either have builders with specific expertise, usually in a different type of technology, or you might have a builder that has the sort of softer skills around, you know, they could put in loft insulation, but they're certainly not going to be able to install a low carbon heating system. And so I think there needs to be, you know, more available training to train the builders already, but also the new, you know, builders coming up through, you know, apprenticeships and training schemes, and to, you know, make that seem like an area that they want to go into, that they, you know, that they're going to make you know, money out of, that they're going to be able to make a business out of. At the moment, you know, there's issues in general in the kind of retrofit industry at the moment anyway, with, you know, increasing cost in materials. So, you know, people are having trouble getting their kitchen extension done, let alone, you know, a whole house retrofit to improve the standards. So the materials are also an issue. And if, you know, if the builders are busy, if they're getting enough work, if they're getting enough business by word of mouth, they don't have an incentive to join up to these schemes. And these schemes often come and go, they're unpredictable, they're complicated, you have to get accredited and pay money for that, you have to do all sorts of extra admin. You may have funding 1 week for it, and then, you know, in the next year it changes slightly and you don't have the funding to deliver that anymore. So I think even, you know, they might be off-putting to householders, some of those schemes, but they're certainly off-putting to some of the industry. And then a lot of these measures are sort of invisible. So once you put in a heating system or you put in insulation, you can't see that anymore. So we need to make sure throughout the whole process of them being put in that they're meeting those standards, because you don't want to have, you know, had your house entirely reclad and rendered and all the paint go on, or have had all your floors come up to put in the new pipe work for your air source heat pump, and then go back down again, and then you have no idea, you know, how well that's been done underneath that and how long it's going to last. And if you probably won't notice the problems until there's something seriously wrong. So there's definitely that side of quality assurance. But there are, you know, other countries are doing that. There is, and there's schemes within the UK where they're, you know, Centre for Sustainable Energy in Bristol has their Future Proof, where they're training up contractors. Carbon Co-op has in Manchester has a really good scheme where they're matching up householders that want work, finding the builders and encouraging them to get the training, and finding the sort of project managers and bringing that all together so people can get that work. But at the moment, it's not a national approach.
It's really interesting, because I think you've just really highlighted the challenge for other countries as well. So yeah, obviously some other countries have got this down pat, and it's probably, you know, they've been able to manage the supply chain challenges. But, you know, if we think about your experience in the UK, strong government systems, you know, first world country, they've got all the resources in the world, and they're still facing those extreme challenges of how to roll that out effectively nationally, and to manage the supply chain issues where yeah, it's already, you know, supply chains in the UK are fairly well developed. So one of the key challenges, I think, will be for other countries that don't, for developing countries that are further behind on the journey. That's a long way. That's a lot of issues they've got to solve. But James, what do you think there?
Well, I think everything you've just discussed is right on the money, really, and I totally agree with what you're saying. I think renewable energy has to be an option in all countries. We can't look at excluding anywhere. Everywhere is using energy, and I think as well there are two different ends when we look at communities, and there are communities in developed countries, underdeveloped countries, and we're not, when we look at renewables, there is not one best fit all solution, and we've got to be practically looking at it on a ground level, and we've got to be looking at where we're applying it and how it's being utilized as well. And what is a really interesting point is, what is its longevity? We might be implementing a certain solution, but how long is it going to last? The cost of implementing it to when it is going to either need further investment, or the time, the man hours, and that to keep that going. That's an interesting area that I don't think we know a lot about currently, because renewable energies are not being deployed in every country and in every community. So I think there's still a lot to learn there. But at the end of the day, like Christabel just said, they've got to be affordable. And I think from communities and countries that can afford renewable energy solutions currently, there's got to be the availability for them to be affordable at all ends of the spectrum, from your small homeowner to right up to the other end of the spectrum, because they're the ones that have got to be using it, and they're the ones that have got to be seen to be uptaking that technology. And if on a day-to-day level, and that people are not utilizing and uptaking these renewable energy technologies, then the other end of the scale, the governments and the policymakers are not going to see the changes that they've wanted to make. And I think a big part of it now is knowledge sharing. And I think from things that get implemented in certain areas, whether it's on one side of the world, and people find a new way to do something, whether it is renewable energy generation or not, that knowledge sharing and that pioneering that technology is a really important part of where we move forward. And as you kind of said earlier, the incentives there have got to be there for the uptake. There's got to be down at that ground level an incentive for people to be changing their gas boiler over to something else. It's got to we can't just be putting more and more pressure on communities.
Yeah, I think I really like that answer, and the fact that it's kind of the responsibility of the developed countries who have created most of the emissions. I mean, if we look at per capita, that's exactly where the emissions are coming from. So it is their responsibility to start implementing these solutions. And once we implement those solutions, that will bring the costs down significantly, as we're already seeing. But that if we can get that if we can get these solutions more rolled out across developed countries, then that will drive the cost down, and that will make it more affordable for these other countries. And hopefully once we've made it more affordable for those other countries, we will hopefully have ironed out all of these supply chain issues and all the issues that Christabel discussed. And then we can, going back to your knowledge sharing there, basically give them kind of what's worked in our countries, and then they can tailor it to their country. That knowledge sharing piece is really interesting, because I think the UK, I'm not sure if you guys have heard of the UK Pact. It's one of the UK government's, there's basically, I think there's 3 pillars to it. One of them is focused on grant funding for particular countries, and they offer grants for basically climate-focused projects. One of them is, I think they've got 5 target countries and they're really helping, they're directing a lot of funding into projects to help those 5 countries to assist on the climate transition. And then the other one is, it's called the UK Experts. It's kind of an experts panel. And that is one of the key knowledge sharing, a really good example of knowledge sharing. So for example, I'm on one of those panels, and I'm on that panel, and I'm helping kind of the Colombian government at the moment, who they want to set up an offshore wind industry. And the UK government have said, well, we're really good at offshore wind. We've got a lot of it. We're the leaders. And so then they've selected experts to basically help the Colombian government to kind of educate them on what's happened in the UK and how it might apply in that region. And yeah, so I think that is such a key point you've raised there, James, in terms of that knowledge sharing. And I think, again, that is the responsibility of these developed countries to go and share that knowledge. We're kind of in this position where, you know, everyone wants to keep their IP, but we don't have enough time for that now. I think particularly on the developed countries front, where most of the problems have been created, it's their responsibility to start sharing that IP and start sharing their solutions so that we can all come on this journey together. So that's, yeah.
One of the things that, what you just said, Bridget, reminded me of is, you know, we're talking here about reducing carbon emissions, but actually everything in this area has real additional other benefits. And when, you know, going to other countries and putting in a reliable, sustainable electricity source, or, you know, an alternative way of cooking so that you're not, you know, getting all sorts of health problems from cooking over an open fire, that's transformational in ways that don't just reduce carbon emissions.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good point you've raised there. I mean, we've been talking about responsibilities and solutions, but the opportunity, I think the opportunity is huge financially, and also in every other aspect. If you think about opportunities, they're huge for everyone. So yeah, I think that's also one thing that needs to be a huge shift in the conversation in terms of, oh, well, we really need to do this, to, well, this is a huge opportunity for us that we can help others benefit from, but we can also benefit from ourselves.
Yeah.
Anybody got anything else to add to that in terms of, I guess, if we focus back on the question about the solutions to how we ensure that renewable energy is a genuine option?
I think there's 2 areas that perhaps that do have to be considered, and one of them has got to be infrastructure. We've got to have, for it to be a genuine option, whether, obviously, when we look at renewable energy, we look at so many different types of technology at the moment. I think it's got to have a stable infrastructure, whether when we discuss about the electric grid, the gas grid, or anything else, it's all about being able to utilize it. There's no point putting in technologies that can't be utilized to their purpose, and we've got to be able to have that, and we've got to be able to have that infrastructure in place that allows us to use that renewable technology, because that's what we all want, and that's what we're all here to do, and we're all here to invest our time in, but if without that infrastructure, it's not going to work.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and interesting from the perspective that some countries that are further behind in this journey might actually be better off in the long run because they don't have to deal with all the old infrastructure that they, that say the UK or other countries already have. So the UK are looking at kind of retrofitting the infrastructure that's already there. But if you've got a country that hasn't got that infrastructure in place, embedded already, you know, if we're talking about the gas lines in converting gas to, say, hydrogen in the UK. If we look at Mexico, the houses here aren't connected to a gas line. So in terms of there's no existing infrastructure to have to convert, it might actually end up being more cost effective in the long run because we don't have that the extra burden of having to deal with all the existing infrastructure. You kind of come in with a clean slate. I think we've seen examples of that in telecommunications, where the telecommunications kind of evolved so quickly that countries that didn't have any in the first place were just able to roll out like 4G. In those countries, they've got better. So I think there's a lot of African nations that have much better kind of telecommunication services than, say, Australia, because we're still trying to upgrade the old infrastructure that was left behind, because nobody wants to say, oh, we'll just get rid of those, we'll just forget about those billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure that we've got. They're trying to retrofit it and fix it. So yeah, it's quite interesting in that infrastructure space. And as you kind of pointed out, I was kind of focusing on that as well. If we look at, say, Texas, for example, who went through at the start of the year where all their gas infrastructure completely froze over and didn't work at all, because we're now entering a new climate where everything that was built before wasn't built for the conditions that we're currently living in now. So the infrastructure piece is a really interesting one because it's super challenging, super expensive. And one of the, you know, we're all talking about, everyone thinks about, oh, we'll just build a wind farm, we'll just put a solar farm in there. But the grid behind it, the infrastructure behind it is actually where a lot of the costs are and where a lot of the challenges are. So it's an interesting one there. Anything else to add to that one? No,
I don't think so.
All right, I think we're on to our last question here, guys. So how can we embed science and evidence during the energy transition? IES, this is obviously a very important one. So what are your thoughts, Christabel?
So I was going to say, actually, I also was an environmental scientist, and like James.
Is that all three of us? I'm also, my background's in environmental science. So, I mean, it makes sense given this is the IES. So there you go.
Yeah. So again, going back to what I was saying earlier, so in the area that I work in, there's, you know, quite a lot of the science and evidence is already there. You know, we've had science and evidence to show that the U values and improving the fabric of buildings, and you know that the ways of, you know, improving health through that, and creating jobs and reducing costs, all of that. Science and evidence is there, but it was a key part in coming up with those solutions. And I think that we're going to be exactly the same when we move to the less tried and tested technologies in terms of low carbon heating. And I think there's a real piece there to, you know, across the domestic and the commercial sector, to be thinking about what the solutions might be, to be testing those solutions in sort of real world conditions, and then for the, you know, where there's been successes, for that evidence to be presented. You know, there's green home schemes all over the country where you can go and visit someone's home, and they've already put in those technologies, and you can hear firsthand how those technologies work. And I think that definitely that leading by example and having those real life scenarios where someone has actually effectively used it is going to win people over. But yeah, I think the science of technology to me is and evidence is already embedded in everything in the area that I'm already working in, and I think that's going to carry on, and certainly the evidence of that it working, and improving people's confidence, and reducing down those costs as well. We've seen huge changes, partly through subsidy, but huge changes in the cost of, say, solar PV, and we're going to need those also in terms of reducing down the costs of other types of technology.
What about you, James? What do you think on that science and technology, science and evidence front?
Well, I agree with how Christabel started the answer to the question there, and it's the same for me in the area that I work in. I wouldn't be doing what I was doing if there wasn't the science and evidence there to start the green energy transition. So as our business sits, we've doing it some amazing things, such as we've got an anaerobic digestion plant which sits as part of our business. We're doing things like adding solar arrays and reducing energy consumption across all our operations, and items like that would not be done if there wasn't science and evidence to do so. And the reduction of carbon emissions that are brought to the forefront of all of our minds now is a huge driver for what we do, and environment as itself is something really important to everyone's operations now. And I think, as well as investing in a greener energy transition, is hopefully also helping to cut cost. I think the science and the evidence is definitely there to do so, and I think the more work we can be doing to battle the negative impacts that climate change is having, and we need to be out here making a difference. And as the evidence and the science shows, there is no way to opt out, and for a greener future, we've got to be leading and be making some positive changes.
And I don't think that's going away. I think that as we scale up or as we make changes, new problems are going to present themselves, and we're going to need solutions to that. And I think even within, the tried and tested areas, there's always improvements that could be made to, for example, insulation materials. There's improvements that could be made to those, those things are going to be developed. I'm always reminded of, when they started putting in wind turbines out at sea, and they realized that both the process of building them and maintaining them created a lot of noise in the water, and so that they were working on solutions to minimizing the impact of that noise on the sea creatures and the sort of currents and things like that, using clever bubble swirls and things like that. So I think whenever we do change these technologies or put them at a greater scale, or put them in a place that perhaps we haven't used them before, there's going to be problems arise that are going to need to be solved and then evidenced, so that people are confident then carrying on putting them in place.
So it's about generating the science and evidence before we develop the solution, but then it's also really important to keep that science, keep kind of reinforcing the evidence and investigating those solutions as they are implemented as well. Totally agree with that. I think with all of the solutions that we have today, we obviously need to keep monitoring them. And the wind turbines is a great one. Solar is also a great one. It is a solution that's already functioning and great, but there's so much room for improvement in all of those, and we're seeing that develop. If we look at offshore wind, they're getting deeper. You're getting floating turbines now. There's a huge amount of research and evidence that needs to be generated as the industry transitions as well. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. A lot of the solutions we have aren't that old in the grand scheme of things. You know, like if we think about a coal-fired power plant, I don't know how old they are. I feel like you guys from the UK might know. 150, that technology is maybe like 150 years old, something like that. They've, over those hundreds of years, they've been further developed and further refined, and you know, it's constantly changing and constantly improving, and that's what we need for all of the solutions that we're currently looking at. And I think that is also a really important solution, important point for all the members of the IES, because I think sometimes, I think it's important for environmental scientists and people within the industry to keep that in mind, that the job isn't done. Once we've developed a solution, the job continues to go on, and we always need to be working hard to improve whatever. We've got a long journey ahead of us, and we always need to be working hard to improving that.
I think there's also a big opportunity for working in partnership and for education, and for, you know, I'm just thinking of all the people that need to be trained to put in insulation and to understand the benefits and values of that. And it's no longer the environmental scientists that are working in this arena. It is so many other jobs that are also required for this change, that actually it's start embedding that sort of science and evidence within all different sectors, and working together, you know, across divides that might not have usually worked together to get the job done. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point. That education and that communication piece is really key, because we're moving now, everybody's coming on this. Every industry is now being sucked into this journey that was typically just an environmental kind of sector. And there's a lot of, I think, for me, there's a lot of, within the environmental space, there's a lot of assumed knowledge. So we assume that the people installing these solutions have an understanding, or the financiers behind them have an understanding of, you know, the intricate climate aspects, but that's not true at all. And then that's, again, I think, going back to the environmental field, their responsibility to communicate that and bring people along the journey. Is there anything else you guys want to add? We've got 10 minutes left, but I think anything else you want to close up on? Anything you feel like we've missed? Any questions you want to go back to?
No, I don't think so. I think we've covered it, in my opinion, quite well. And I think in the climate we're in, we are going to be battling more and more for a greener energy future, and we need to keep pushing, whether we are working in doesn't matter what sector you're working in, we all need to be doing our bit for that greener future. And I think we've all got a role to play. And like you kind of touched on there, Brigette, at the end of the day, you don't have to have an environmental job role to be concerned and applying a positive green environment to what you do. It's involved in all sectors, and everything we all do now is looking at that greener future, and we can all do our bit. And I think that we need to be doing so, because it is a no opt-out scenario, and we've all got to be committed to doing something. And if we're all committed to making that positive environmental change, then I don't see why it can't happen, because we've started and we're seeing positive changes now, and we need to continue on that road.
Christabel, did you want to add anything?
I was just going to say, with my energy advisor hat on, that anyone who's watching this who's inspired by what we've been talking about, you can do things almost immediately in your life to help this. You can change the tariff that you're on. You can choose a tariff that's investing in renewables. There's different levels of investing in renewables, but you can find ones that are investing in renewables, that are investing in different forms of electricity. But and now you can also find ones that are investing in AD and other forms of producing gas. You can look at how you can conserve energy at home. Those two are sort of simple, almost immediate options you can do if you can afford that. And then, the next step, really looking at the energy efficiency of the home that you're in and thinking about all the other benefits you could get from doing that. And then, maybe down the line a bit, thinking about low carbon heating if your heating is on its way out, or you're just really keen and interested in it. There are options out there, and you could be one of those early adopters that brings people around to their house to show them how it all works. So yeah, I think that this is an area that people can definitely make immediate changes in their life if they want to.
I love this. We've got the solutions already. It's just about us putting them in place now. And I think you're absolutely right. We've got the solutions, we've got that, and now we've got the political will as well. Now everybody's thinking about it. So this is such an opportunity for such great change. So yeah, what a perfect note to end on. So thank you so much for your time today, guys. That was really interesting, and hopefully of value to our watchers as well. So thanks so much.